So, after over 2 years of anticipation, Elden Ring's DLC expansion, Shadow of the Erdtree, is finally out, and the overall consensus is, well, there really isn't one. On one hand, most reviewers absolutely love the DLC, and a good percentage of fans and content creators agree, but on the other hand, outlets such as Eurogamer and other fans of Elden Ring have asserted that Shadow of the Erdtree is too hard, and that it's clearly the game's fault and totally not theirs. With both of these camps waging a war larger than the Shattering online, I find myself to be somewhere in the middle, and I'm left in a similar state as I was when I finished the base game of Elden Ring for the first time. Something within this game is broken, shattered, if you will. After playing through the DLC 4 separate times, I'm confident in saying that a lot of Shadow of the Erdtree is significantly better than the base game of Elden Ring. Yet also in that same package lie some of the worst design decisions I've ever seen from Software, to the point where I genuinely wonder if they learned anything from the critical reception to the base game since its release in 2022. This review will go in depth on every major boss, area, and other aspect worth dissecting to figure out why Shadow of the Erdtree casts such a dark shadow on the future of the series, in my opinion. Needless to say, there will be spoilers for the entirety of the DLC going forward, but before that, I want to stress that if there's one thing you should take away from this video, it's this. While it may have several problems, Shadow of the Erdtree is an incredible expansion that is absolutely worth its $40 price tag. In my opinion, the highs are higher than those of the base game, and the lows, while definitely bad, aren't nearly as awful as their base game counterparts. The criticisms I plan to lay out in the script do not and should not invalidate that or your enjoyment of Shadow of the Erdtree whatsoever, considering that, at the end of the day, all of this is just my opinion. With all that being said, let's get started. Shadow of the Erdtree starts off after both Starscourge Radahn and Mohg Lord of Blood have been defeated, which already puts this content into a bit of a tricky spot. Many of the base game's problems arose during the final third of the game, with bosses such as Malenia and Elden Beast being ill omens of FromSoft's future boss design, and that definitely shows up in this DLC, but we'll get to that later. While I think Radahn and Mohg are much better than those two, it still places the DLC in the uncanny Souls Valley that is the last third of Elden Ring. Upon being teleported to the Land of Shadow via a Fade to Black loading screen, which is kind of underwhelming compared to previous FromSoft DLCs in my opinion, you wake up in a small cave and exit to see a beautiful view of the open world before you, recreating the feeling that every open world game since Breath of the Wild has tried to replicate, including base game Elden Ring with the introduction to Limgrave. It's a trend in modern open world games that I'm actually quite fond of, and here in Shadow of the Erdtree, I think it's at its best. The gravesite plane is beautiful, and the Shadow Tree looming in the distance is a wonderful contrast to how bright the base game was with the Erdtree always dominating the horizon. One thing that stays true for the entire DLC is that the art style and graphics of this game are absolutely gorgeous from start to finish, with the only hang-up being the occasional pop-in on the grass here and there in the gravesite plane, which doesn't happen often and it doesn't impact gameplay in any way, so I'm not going to count it against the DLC, but I do still think it was worth mentioning. The DLC wastes no time in letting the player go wherever they want. You could theoretically get to almost any area in this expansion within an hour if you know what you're doing. You can skip R'Lana, who we'll get to later, to get to Shadow Altus by going around Castle Ensis, similar to how you could get to Liurnia in the base game by going around Stormvale Castle. You can get to the Jagged Peak and Cerulean Coast by going down the Dragon's Pit mini-dungeon, you can get to the Ancient Ruins of Ra by going through Shadow Keep, and so on and so forth. The only areas that you can't get to almost immediately, from my knowledge, are the Stone Coffin Fissure, which you can only access by making a bit of progress in the DLC, and enter Ilum, the final Legacy dungeon of this expansion. I really like how From lets the player do this, especially for those who want to use one of the new weapon types that are added in this DLC. Speaking of those weapon types, all of them are fantastic additions that I wouldn't mind grabbing and starting New Game Plus with, just so I could play through the whole game with them. In particular, the new Great Katanas, Backhand Blades, Light Greatswords, and Martial Arts weapon classes are incredibly fun. The Beast Claws are interesting, even though they're the one I tested out the least. The Dueling Shields are a nice addition, and the Perfume Bottles and Throwing Knives are nice permanently usable versions of consumable items in the base game, although in my opinion the range of the Throwing Knives leaves a lot to be desired. Each of these new weapon types, along with the new weapons for existing weapon classes, naturally encourage the player to experiment with new build types, which I really enjoy. This is even further enhanced by smithing stones being common exploration rewards throughout the DLC, except that the base game already has bell bearings that allow the player to just purchase however many smithing stones they need whenever they want. And with how many runes the enemies and bosses in this DLC give to the player, smithing stone scarcity is not a problem whatsoever, meaning that a good portion of the rewards in this expansion amount to jack shit in the grand scheme of things, something that was also common in the base game. It's honestly really disappointing that FromSoft once again failed to create meaningful exploration rewards just like in the base game, and their main attempt at fixing that issue arguably fares even worse. With that said, it's time to talk about the big topic of discussion surrounding Shadow of the Erdtree, the Shadow Tree fragments, and how they impact the difficulty of this DLC. Shadow Tree fragments are Shadow of the Erdtree's main form of character progression, and are something that I appreciate a lot more in theory than I do in practice. Upon picking up your first fragment, whether it be from the church to the southeast of the starting area, the cross to the north, or from the pot shadowed by the scorched ruins, the tutorial message explaining them criminally downplays how important these things are to enjoying the DLC, in my opinion. The message says, quote, "The Shadow Tree Blessing bolsters the recipient's abilities to deal and negate damage, but has no influence outside the Land of Shadow." That's it. In reality, these things are essentially required if you want to have any fun with the DLC because of how powerful and girthy these bosses are, to the point where at max Shadow Tree level, you'll be dealing more than double the damage you do at level 1, and taking less than half the original damage from enemy attacks. Make no mistake, these are permanent passive stat increases that several critics wanted as exploration rewards, and in theory this is exactly what they wanted. By exploring and finding these fragments, you are actively strengthening your character and making the game more fun, regardless of your build. In practice, however, this means that if you want to have any fun with the bosses at all, you need to find these fragments, which are scattered across the map in Asinine locations, because the bosses are designed around you having them. Sure, finding a guaranteed fragment at the several crosses in the Land of Shadow is good, but some of them are located in random caves, dropped by enemies that have no indication that they drop anything of significance, and 10% of them are locked behind the worst designed boss in the game, who we'll get to later. This is why so many people say that the DLC is too hard, because in practice, having so many fragments that increase your damage dealt and decrease damage taken is the only thing that makes the bosses in this DLC manageable, and so while appearing optional, they are required. The game becomes a grocery list of things that you need to pick up while you're in the open world, otherwise, you are going to get your shit kicked in. It's to the point that, by the time you get to the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree, if you haven't already gotten all of the fragments, which most players won't on their first blind playthrough, you are essentially required to look up a guide. To qualify that statement, I don't think using guides for these games is inherently wrong, especially if you're looking for a specific weapon, Ash of War, talisman, or spell that will make the game more enjoyable for your build, but if doing so is required to enjoy the game's content, that's too much in my opinion. And with how many fragments there are, 50 in total by the way, it's going to take you a long-ass time to get them all. It's also important to note that in order to reach level 20, which is the highest Shadow Realm blessing, you need to find all 50 of these fragments, something that wasn't true for Golden Seeds in the base game, which had 41 total and you only needed 30 to get the max amount of flasks. This was true for the Sacred Tears in the base game, but I give those a pass because all 12 of them were located in churches that were all clearly marked on the map, which is not true for the Shadow Tree fragments. To be clear, the game doesn't expect you to come at every single boss with a maxed out Shadow Tree blessing, because you're clearly intended to find them as you go, but that brings up another problem with these that directly ties into the boss design of this DLC. If your Shadow Tree blessing is too low, the bosses will do way too much damage and you do too little, but if your Shadow Tree blessing is too high, then you've officially made the boss an absolute pushover. To test this, I went out of my way on an extra playthrough of this DLC to get as many fragments as I could before fighting the Dancing Lion, one of the first bosses of the DLC, and he was an absolute fucking joke. This issue could easily be solved if the race closest to these bosses had a message that displayed the recommended Shadow Tree blessing level for that area, which I understand isn't typical for Souls games, but for something like this, the balancing of the game is entirely dependent on the player collecting an unspecified amount of these fragments, which, especially in a first playthrough, is not an onus that should be put on the player. I understand that wanting to include a sense of progression in a DLC that takes place in the endgame of Elden Ring kind of put From Software into a bind as to how to go about that, and I think that their attempt to kill two birds with one stone, exploration rewards and game progression, is very admirable, but it falls just short of working how they intended, to the point where I vehemently dislike the way that it's implemented into the game as is. This will get worse when we start talking about the bosses, but we'll save that for later. I've already gotten tired of talking about these pieces of shit, so let's move on to covering the rest of the Gravesite Plain, which thankfully I have a lot more positive things to say about. After the player travels through the main field of the Gravesite Plain, either ignoring or fighting the Furnace Golem present in the middle, the player comes to a fork in the road, with one path leading to Belarus, the Tower Settlement, and the other leading to Castle Ensis. We'll start with Belarus because I feel like that's the way that most players will go on their first run through, and it's also where I went on mine. I know that a lot of this video up until this point has been relatively negative, but these aspects are something that really only rear their head once you progress much further into the DLC. As of this early in the expansion, Shadow of the Erdtree makes a really good first impression with its visuals, exploration, and combat variety, and all of that comes to a head in its first Legacy dungeon with Belarus. The dungeon itself is relatively simple, and that's okay. For most players who are coming back to Elden Ring for this DLC after however long of a gap from the last time they played it, a simple dungeon like this is a great way to get them back into the swing of things. That's not to say that this dungeon is easy. There are several sections and enemies in here that pose a real challenge, with the Horned Knights being a particular standout. They're relentless and aggressive while also providing openings for attack, and they don't really have too much health to be annoying even if you're at Shadow Blessing level 0. They're a nice little mini-boss in the dungeons that they do appear in, and I don't have much negative to say about them. There are harder versions of these enemies in the final Legacy dungeon, which funnily enough is right above Belarus, which are also good, but I don't like them as much, but we'll talk about that for later. Gee, I'm saying that a lot in the script so far, and I'm going to keep on saying it until we get to later, which you'll know when later is. One particular aspect of this dungeon that I'd like to highlight is its music. I'm actually listening to it while writing this part of the script. The haunting choir singing combined with the violins is simultaneously soothing and epic. It reminds me a lot of the Shrine of Amana themes from Dark Souls 2, which is another one of my favorites. This track is one of many OSTs in the game that are absolutely incredible, and I'll point them out whenever they come up from here on out. Eventually, after maneuvering your way through the dilapidated landscape that is Belarus, you'll eventually make it to the top and encounter what is likely the first boss of many people's playthrough, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. I'll be upfront and say that this is my favorite boss in the DLC. It's actually a really close race between him and several other bosses in this expansion that we'll get to later, which is a really good thing in my opinion, and shows how for many of these bosses, FromSoft learned from the feedback on Elden Ring's endgame and managed to create several incredible fights in this DLC that stand toe-to-toe with many of the best fights from other games in the Souls series. This DLC has, in my opinion, at least 6 incredible boss fights that have this level of quality. The Dancing Lion, Putrescent Knight, Mesmer, Midra, the Shadow Tree Avatar, and Ramina. R'Lana is just shy of making that list as well, but is held back by a few things we'll get to later. Back to the Divine Beast, upon entering his arena, a cutscene plays that really sets the tone for how this fight goes. In reality, this thing is 2 or 3 guys in a costume that probably has some sort of supernatural element given all that happens in Phase 2, and it also seems to have some level of sentience on its own, all of which adds to the somewhat eerie vibe he gives off. It's a really cool design and one of the more memorable ones in the entire Souls series, in my opinion. The fight itself doesn't fall into most of the pitfalls difficulty-wise that most other bosses in this DLC fall into, and I'm pretty sure that's because he's intended to be fought early in the DLC. I wouldn't know for sure though, because there's no indication of when you should fight him. In my first playthrough, I fought him at Shadow Tree level 3 and had a difficult yet fun time, and beat him after around an hour and a half, and I have mostly good things to say about him. His attacks can be hard to dodge, but almost all of them have clear and consistent punish windows between them, to the point that this feels like a dance. The fight isn't perfect though, and I do have a few small issues with it. The biggest one has to do with his grab attack. The grab itself isn't too hard to dodge, but afterwards your next heal will be absorbed by the boss, which I think is just a little too mean for the first major boss of the expansion. It's just for this one attack, and the dodge timing is relatively easy to learn, so I don't count it against the boss too much. Once the boss gets to about 3/5 of his health bar, he goes into Phase 2, which has more attacks that made me raise an eyebrow. When it's in its lightning form, several of its attacks will summon lightning spots on the ground and strike a few seconds after the attack finishes, kind of like Slave Knight Gale in Dark Souls 3. My problem with these is that if you perfectly dodge one of the Dancing Lion's attacks during this phase, you could land on one of these spots and not have enough time to react to be able to dodge it and still get in a punish. It makes the lightning form of this boss force the player to be a bit more passive than usual, which I would normally dislike, but I don't hold it against this boss too much since you can still punish a lot of attacks, and the boss usually doesn't stay in this form for too long. The other forms of this boss, the wind and ice forms, are honestly pretty good, and I have little to criticize them for. Overall, a lot of this fight is based on positioning and figuring out the correct responses to certain attacks. The spinning breath move in particular is a nasty one at first, but it's pretty easy to dodge once you know how to do so. I do think that the arena of this boss scene is a little bit too small for this kind of boss. There were several times on multiple playthroughs when the lion would pin me against the wall and cause the camera to freak out in response, so I wouldn't be able to see anything and I died. But maybe that's more of a problem with the camera than it is the boss, so take that as you will. While I do really love this boss, I do think that its quality greatly diminishes by two things you encounter as you get further into the DLC. The first of which is that, sadly, this is not a unique boss. You can find another dancing lion just roaming the world in the northwest part of the map, and I hate that so much. Like, FromSoft, did you learn nothing from Godric, Margit, or Estelle? Even worse, the second version of the Dancing Lion has a Deathblight phase where he summons basilisks, which he can do at will infinitely. It's like they're giving a middle finger to the people who complained about boss reuse in the main game. Thankfully, this is the only case of new Remembrance boss reuse in the DLC, as far as I know, but boss reuse is something we'll talk about a lot more later. The other thing that makes this fight worse in hindsight is that it's entirely pointless. You may be asking, what do you mean by that, and I'll tell you. After you beat the Dancing Lion, you can go up an elevator and long staircase to find a door blocked by shadowy thorns, giving the impression that you should come back later after finding a way to get rid of them, kind of like the thorns in the Erdtree in the base game. It's a nice moment that encourages re-exploring areas you've already been to once you've gone around and explored the rest of the world. Eventually, you figure out that to get into the Shadow Tower where Mikola is, you have to burn down the Sealing Tree. To do this, you need to kill two bosses, Mesmer the Impaler and Ramina Saint of the Blood, both of whom I really enjoy, and I'll talk about them more later. After beating both of these bosses, you finally get to burn the Sealing Tree, and then you're just teleported to Enter Ilum. I don't think it's unreasonable for players who have already beaten the Dancing Lion to think, oh, I need to get back there since I can access it now, or for players who haven't to think, okay, time to explore and find an entrance to that place. Yet this teleport allows for neither. What's even worse is that this teleport and the previously thorn-blocked door lead to the exact same site of grace, neither having any substance on the way there. So why have the teleport, FromSoft? This means that there is literally no point to finding the Dancing Lion unless you want the headpiece it gives you out of the fight, or one of its remembrance items. Although I do really like the headpiece. It gives +4 to strength and dexterity at the cost of reduced healing, which is just insane, and I love it so much. I honestly think this DLC would be so much better if this teleport and the small area leading from it to the first main grace of Enter Ilum were just removed entirely. I'm sorry for being so negative toward the end there. I really do love this fight. I'm just sad that apparently FromSoft didn't love it enough to give it the grandiosity that it truly deserved, in my opinion. From here, the player is most likely to head to Castle Ensis, the second major legacy dungeon in this DLC, though technically they could also make their way to the Dragon Pit and explore other areas and yada yada, but we're just going to head on to Castle Ensis and one of the expansion's more controversial bosses. I honestly don't have too much to say about Castle Ensis as a legacy dungeon. It's relatively inoffensive, but it's also overshadowed by Belarus coming so close before it and the Shadowkeep that come after it, so this one kind of feels a little bit forgettable in my opinion. I'm actually struggling to think of what's actually in this dungeon now that I think about. The main things to note from this DLC are the NPC mini-boss halfway through that can absolutely kick your shit in, which I don't really hold against the dungeon of the NPC, since NPC fights in these games are always a little wonky, but that's besides the point. Aside from that, there's not really too much to this dungeon, aside from the first light greatsword you can pick up, so we're just going to go ahead and move on to Rolana. Rolana is a boss that, to me personally, is just barely outside the realm of being an incredible boss. The first time I fought her, I absolutely hated her, as it took me nearly 4 hours to beat her for the first time, and when I finally did, I said out loud, oh my god, I hated every second of that. I'm confident that the main source of my frustration with her on my first playthrough was due to having not connected enough Shadow Tree fragments by the time I got to her, which returns back to the previous issues that I discussed earlier. In my first playthrough, I fought her at Shadow level 3, after exploring what I felt to be a pretty good amount of the map up until that point. In reality, I was significantly underleveled for this fight. I would say that this fight is meant to be done somewhere between level 5 and level 7. This is the first time any FromSoft title has ever had an issue with levels and grinding, which I think is a huge problem. In previous games, and even the base game of Elden Ring, if a boss was hard and you were technically underleveled for it, you could beat it simply by getting better at the fight, learning attack patterns, and overcoming the odds. That's what makes these games fun, in my opinion. With Shadow of the Erdtree, that's no longer true anymore, because these bosses have so much health and do so much damage that you're essentially required to have a high enough shadow level if you want to have any fun with them at all. Most of the bosses in this DLC suffer from this problem, but I think Rolana suffers from it the worst since she's placed so early on in the DLC. Technically, you can skip her and go straight to Shadow Altus if you take a secret path around Castle Ensis, but most people won't know that without looking up a guide. So, if we assume that most people are going to stick to the gravesite plan until they beat this boss, then there are around 14 Shadow Tree fragments that you can find prior to fighting Rolana, which would place you right at Shadow level 7 like I recommended earlier, so what's the problem? Well, 4 of those fragments are in the Jagged Peak and Cerulean Coast area, which you can only get to if you go through the Dragon's Pit, something I didn't know on my first playthrough, and I suspect not a lot of people will either, especially if they're playing blind. Just look at how long it took Lil Aggie to find this area. Additionally, 2 of the Shadow Tree fragments out of the 10 that are left over are held by Shadow Pot enemies, something that doesn't seem to draw a lot of attention at first, and one of them is located at the Cliffside Terminus site of Grace, which I didn't figure out how to get to until several hours after I beat Rolana, something I'm convinced a lot of people will also experience, since the only way to get there is to ignore the giant legacy dungeon that is Belarus and take a hard left and go up the obscured cliffside. With all that in consideration, that leaves most players with, at most, 8 Shadow Tree fragments prior to fighting Rolana, enough to get you to Shadow Tree level 4, which is, in my opinion, too low to have fun with this boss. Maybe that's changed since the most recent patch where they reworked the Shadow Tree fragment progression, but I think that my point mostly still stands. This leaves the player with 2 options: bang their head against this boss until they or she cracks, or look up a guide, whether that's a guide on Shadow Tree fragments you can find before her, or a guide on how to skip her. I really don't like how FromSoft designed her like this, and that's a shame because when taken out of the context that the game puts her in, I think Rolana is a really good fight. She reminds me a lot of Pontiff Sullivan from Dark Souls 3, which I'm pretty sure was intentional since she has the same magic and fire swords that he did. During her first phase, she's a lot less aggressive, only going for the player if the player is close enough to her while leaving good openings for players to punish after dodging her attacks. I'm not sure how the fight fares from a magic user's point of view, but then again, I'm not sure if magic is the best way to go about this fight, since I'm pretty sure she also resists magic. I mean, she's Renala's sister after all, lore-wise, but anyway, back on topic. Once Rolana reaches her second phase, she becomes significantly more aggressive, giving the player very little room to breathe or heal. You can still make openings to heal, especially if you put some distance between you and the boss while she's attacking, but she's just a little bit too aggressive in my opinion. It's not terrible though, since unlike other bosses in this game that are just as aggressive as her, Rolana still has consistent punish windows in this fight for you to either get a hit in or heal during her small moments of downtime. In particular, her 5-hit ranged magic combo is a really good time to roll forwards into the attacks and hit her once or twice, or get a good heal in. Her other major attack that's worth mentioning is her Twin Moon attack, which a lot of players really don't like, but I honestly don't see a problem with it, as you can jump over it pretty easily without taking any damage. I do think that it isn't communicated very well that you need to jump, something you can say about a lot of bosses in Elden Ring actually, and would have been better if there was some sort of visual cue like in Sekiro to show that you need to dodge this by jumping. I also don't like that if you get hit by the first blast from her Twin Moon attack, that you're locked into getting hit by the second and third blast, which will likely kill a lot of players at this point in the DLC, especially if you have a low Shadow Tree level, and it just feels a little cheap in my opinion. Aside from all of that though, I really do like Rolana, when she isn't killing me in 3 hits that is. When I fought her again in my second playthrough, it only took me 15 minutes across 4 attempts to beat her at Shadow level 7, and it was a really fast-paced fight that I enjoyed quite a bit, but the fight as a whole is just brought down by everything around it. Once you beat Rolana, you emerge out onto Shadow Altus, the central region of the game that connects to almost every single area of the Land of Shadow. From here, you can essentially go anywhere and tackle things in any order that you'd like, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to save all of the optional stuff until just before we burn the Sealing Tree to access the final Legacy Dungeon. When you get to Shadow Altus for the first time, you'll see another Furnace Golem on the horizon, and so I think it's finally time to talk about them. These guys were a big part of the marketing for Shadow of the Erdtree, and so the first time I saw one back in the Gravesite plane, I was really excited to try and take down something this huge. It's almost as big as Fire Giant in the base game, maybe even bigger. I don't know the exact size of their models in comparison to each other. Instead, what I was met with was a mini-boss that has 3 attacks total, and is one of the most boring fights I've ever had in any game, period. To take down these guys, you have to close the distance by avoiding their first attack, which is kicking flaming rocks at you. These will probably one-shot Torrent if you don't avoid them, something that's true for a lot of these things' attacks. Once you get close, you just keep hitting their ankles until they go down, which takes fucking forever, all while avoiding their second attack, their fire stomps, and their third attack, lazily trying to grab you. That's it. That is all of the attacks that these things have. A couple have a really long ranged attack where they bend down and send a fire tornado at you, which is a cool set piece, but it doesn't really change how you go about the fight. What's even worse is that your individual attacks do jack shit for damage, only for you to knock it down and hit it with a critical attack to deal half its health bar. Then you have to knock him down all over again from scratch. I genuinely don't know what From Software was thinking when designing this thing to be so boring and bullshit. Almost all of its attacks will one-shot you, even at maximum Shadow Tree level, and sometimes they'll even fall on uneven terrain to prevent you from riposting them, making the fight take even longer. The rewards for killing these things after an eternity and a half aren't even that great. They drop 15k runes, which is less than some regular enemies in this DLC, and way less than any of the bosses, as well as some crystal tears for your Physic Flask. And that's it. In my opinion, a lot of these new sacred tiers still aren't able to hold a candle to the tried and true Opaline Bubble tier except for one, the deflecting hard tier that you get from killing the first Furnace Golem that you see in the Gravesite plane. Aside from that one, every single tier barely has any use over tiers from the base game, except for maybe the Stamina Elimination tier. I won't know, because I never used it. The deflecting hard tier is worth further examination because it adds in a mechanic that, frankly, feels like a slap in the fucking face to anyone playing this game. It adds the perfect guard parry from Sekiro to your moveset temporarily. The buff lasts for 3 minutes total, which for some of these boss fights won't be nearly enough, and like in Sekiro, the timing for getting these perfect blocks is very precise. The precise timing works in Sekiro because every boss and enemy is designed around teaching and testing your mastery of that deflect. That isn't true for Elden Ring, so it just makes me question why they added it into this game in the first place. I'd be less angry if they had made this mechanic into a talisman, or hell, even an armor piece, because it would be permanent so long as you had it on. But having a temporary buff for it makes it feel completely fucking useless in my opinion. Like so many other things in this DLC, this mechanic was so close to being good, but FromSoft had to go Elden Ring it up, a derogatory term that I'm going to start using for the rest of this video. And trust me, I will be using it a lot. For now, we're going to continue on to the Shadow Keep. There are several Shadow Tree fragments and other things to find in and around this area, especially with how much it connects to the rest of the map, including a fight with Dryleaf Dane that rewards you with the martial arts weapon, which I want to reiterate is some of the most fun that I've ever had with combat in this game. I'm not really a fan of how the fight can only be triggered by using a gesture, but I don't really hold it against the game too much, since when you pick up Dane's note, it comes with the gesture you need to start the fight, so I think a lot of players can put 2 and 2 together, unless you're me and you had to look up a guide for it, but that's more on me, not as much on the game. The Shadow Keep is, without a doubt, the best legacy dungeon in Shadow of the Erdtree, and stands along with Stormveil Castle and Lane Dell as a prime example of how incredible dungeon design in Elden Ring can be. There are 2 entrances to get into this place for the first time, and in total it connects to 7 regions if you count the 2 entrances I first mentioned. These gateways are placed all around the tower and all organically connect to each of these regions, and I think that's absolutely incredible, and on par and even exceeding some aspects of Dark Souls 1's world design. This dungeon is essentially a combination of the Astral Clock Tower from Bloodborne and New Londo from Dark Souls 1. That second one can't even be disputed since you literally drain the water in the church district via a cutscene just like in Dark Souls 1. The whole thing feels a little derivative, but that doesn't stop it from being fun to explore. Then the first thing you see when walking through the main entrance is a giant hippo. The Golden Hippopotamus is one of the new bosses in the CLC, though compared to the Remembrance bosses, he's not really much to write home about. There are 4 other smaller hippos out in the world that drop Shadow Tree fragments, but none of them are as big as this one, nor do they have a second phase like this golden variant. He suffers from something that a lot of big beast bosses suffer from in these games, and that's broken hitboxes. In the footage you're seeing right now, I'm taking damage from attacks that flat out did not hit me, and with how much damage the hippo does even at higher Shadow Tree blessing levels, I'm surprised that these hitboxes weren't more fine-tuned than they were. This gets worse when going into the second phase, where he now gets crucible attacks, including a budget version of Aldrich's arrow spam attack, a Beyblade spin that requires incredibly precise dodge timing in my experience, and a big roll that, if it hits you, will either be a one-shot or close to a one-shot. I've had fights with this guy in the past where this roll hit me only once, but dealt damage to me twice, which killed me instantly, which is kind of fucked up. I'm still mad about it, honestly. I don't actively dislike this boss. He isn't very memorable and doesn't take too long to kill, but he does exhibit some issues that I have with the DLC. From there, the actual area that the game calls Shadowkeep isn't too long. You just loop around until you get to a big bridge that also acts as a shortcut back to the Golden Hippo Grace, which, also side note, this Grace is literally 5 seconds away from the one just outside its boss room. Can't be a Souls game if we don't have redundant checkpoints. This area also serves as the main way to get to the Abyssal Woods, which we'll talk about later when we get to the optional bosses and areas. For now, we continue forward into the Specimen Storehouse, which is the main part of this dungeon. In all honesty, I fucking love this place. It's so complex, with 7 different floors, maybe even more if you count the rafters, links to several other areas, shortcuts, the dungeon changing layouts halfway through as a solution to get to the boss, the food, the atmosphere, everything's flawless. The only thing I don't like about this dungeon is the Mesmer soldiers who shoot fire at you, and for some reason I just cannot seem to stagger consistently, but I'd say that's more of a problem with me than it is with the enemy of the dungeon. We'll get to Mesmer in just a second, but if you thought we were done with the Shadowkeep, you're dead fucking wrong, because there's a whole other side area accessible from a different part of the map that leads back into the main Shadowkeep, and itself serves as a mini legacy dungeon. This is the New Londo area that I mentioned earlier. This area makes really good use of the jump button added in Elden Ring to create some tense platforming sections that aren't too challenging in my opinion, but still pretty tense. Even cooler, while you're exploring this area while it's still submerged in water, you'll occasionally feel small earthquakes, literally if you're playing on controller, and see some snake-like creatures sneaking around in the water. The first time I saw this, I was really excited. Imagine a sea monster boss that you can fight while the water is risen. Lower the water to trigger a phase transition, kind of like Ancient Wyvern in Dark Souls 3, but good. And then you get to fight it on land with an all-new moveset. The first part of that didn't end up happening, but that's okay. The cutscene where the water drains from the area places a big emphasis on this tree in the center of the church district, right next to a new site of grace. Everything about this was screaming that we were going to be fighting some sort of sea monster. Then you get into the middle and... it's another fucking ulcerated tree spirit. Now would probably be a good time to talk about one of my biggest issues with this DLC, unnecessary boss reuse. We already talked about the second Dancing Lion, how bad that was, but at least that's the only instance of a new Remembrance boss being reused in this DLC as far as I'm aware. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the base game bosses. This ulcerated tree spirit is one of 3 instances where this enemy type is reused, another one of which is in the same area not even 2 fucking feet away from this first one. The other one is near a waterfall, and at the very least it's a new poison variant of the thing, but they all still have the same moveset and same problems that all the tree spirits in the base game had. Here's a question I have for From Software. Why are these guys even here? Both from a game design standpoint and a lore standpoint. If they were gonna reuse main game bosses, why couldn't they have used an actually good one, like Tree Sentinel? Oh wait, they did reuse Tree Sentinel in this DLC, twice, in a row! I get that this encounter is meant to be a reuse of the dual Tree Sentinel fight outside of Lanedale, and that these two probably have a lore reason to be here given the Shaman village nearby, but I won't lie and say that I wasn't disappointed to see this much reuse. This got even worse because later in the same area as those reused Tree Sentinels, I found another Falling Star Beast from the base game. Again, I understand that there's probably lore reasons for why these guys are here, but my god, couldn't you have designed a new and interesting variant or something? Additionally, there's also a Deathrate bird in Karo's Hidden Grove, 3 back-to-back flying dragon bosses on the Jagged Peak, 2 Ghost Flame Dragons, who I'm counting as reused because their movesets are only barely different from the base game dragons, and an Ancient Dragon, also on Jagged Peak. I understand that it's a really big ask to have a DLC with a 2-year development time provide a completely unique set of enemies, but this amount of reuse and in such close proximity really disappointed me while playing through DLC. This even soured the discovery of new regions of the map for me. Discovering the hinterland area in the northeast portion of the map should have been an amazing experience of discovering the final major area of the map that I hadn't been to yet, with such incredible scenery, only for me to encounter 2 back-to-back tree sentinels, followed almost immediately by a falling star beast, which itself is followed immediately by the finger runes of Deo, which span you with a bunch of reused hand enemies from Caria Manor. I genuinely cannot believe that they stuck so many reused enemies and bosses in this one part of the map that is hidden away and you have to work to get to. It's like a slap in the face to those who want to explore this entire DLC. Not only that, going through the hinterland is mandatory if you want to fight one of the actual new bosses in this game that we'll talk about later, so if you want to experience all the new content in this DLC, you have to trudge through rampant reuse of the old content. Returning back to the topic at hand, your reward for draining the water in the Church District is access to a new area of the Shadow Keep, as well as a pathway to one of my favorite optional bosses in this DLC, the Shadow Tree Avatar. We'll talk more about him later, but for now, let's move on to taking on all 18 inches of this area's main boss and the poster child for this DLC, Mesmer the Impaler.
Mongrel Intruder. That tarnished, it seemeth.
In my opinion, Mesmer is one of the best bosses that From Software has ever created, something that I was pleasantly surprised by coming from the base game of Elden Ring. He's just behind the Dancing Lion for me in terms of favorite bosses from this DLC, and if we count the Deathblight version of Dancing Lion as well, then Mesmer easily takes the top spot for me. I've seen a lot of people online praising Mesmer for how fun the fight is, while also highlighting how difficult they think he is, to the point that famed player Let Me Solo Her has officially gone into Phase 2 of Let Me Solo Him in order to help players take on Mesmer. Personally, I don't find Mesmer to be that challenging, especially compared to fights like Melania in the base game, but he strikes a near perfect balance of hard but fair that FromSoft managed to capture again several times in this DLC. Though maybe my relative ease with him comes from my tendency to explore as much as possible prior to fighting him, aka fighting every other Remembrance boss before him, but that's just how I like to play, and the fight is still fun regardless, so it doesn't really matter as far as I'm concerned. Mesmer does something that very few of the bosses in Elden Ring, mainly the base game, actually do, which is, shocker, telegraphing his fucking attacks. There are a few bosses in this DLC, with Mesmer and Romina being the standouts, who telegraph their overhead explosion attacks with a quick flash before plummeting down, and I really like this. It rewards the player for being attentive to the boss's tells and makes it so they don't have to feel out the timing on the move. This flash is unfortunately missing in Phase 2, but instead the timing is telegraphed by the movement of the serpent's head, which isn't as easy to read in my opinion, but then again, I've never been hit by the attack and a dozen of times I've gotten to second phase, so maybe I'm just not giving it enough credit. Most of Mesmer's attacks in both Phase 1 and Phase 2 hit really hard, but are also perfectly capable of being avoided. He has several delayed attacks like every enemy in this fucking game, but I think here they work because they deliberately punish panic rolling. For example, in this attack where Mesmer does a sweep and then jumps up to prepare for a punching attack, if you roll again immediately after rolling from this sweep, you will get hit every single time. So instead, you dodge it by holding out for a little longer before dodging it. Mesmer has several attacks like this, including the attack where he drags a spear on the ground before thrusting it into your skull, but I never found myself getting frustrated by them in the same way I did by bosses like Melania, Radagon, Fire Giant, etc. There are 3 attacks that I do have problems with, but thankfully none of them are even close to being as bullshit as something like Waterfowl Dance. The first is when he does a double spin in the air, with the second spin being the main attack. For some reason, I just cannot seem to get this dodge right. Part of me wants to say it's a bad hitbox, but I honestly think it's just me not being good at dodging an attack, and that's okay, since the attack itself doesn't do too much damage, and still gives you room to dodge the follow-up. The second attack I have a problem with is during a signature combo that he ends with plunging his spear into the ground and creating an AoE with several spears coming from the ground. The AoE itself isn't the problem for me, but rather the part where he does 5 insanely quick fiery spear thrusts while in the air. Even if you roll right as the first one is about to hit you, I'm confident that the timing to dodge all 5 of these hits is extremely tight. I hesitate to call it unavoidable damage, especially since theoretically he could just use it and miss you entirely, especially if you're using summons, but I'm not a huge fan of that part of the combo. Again, though, I don't think it's a huge deal because taking one or two hits from this flurry of attacks won't kill you on its own, and even if you do get hit by it, you aren't prevented from dodging the follow-up AoE. Lastly, his grab attack where he throws you on his spear is a little problematic for two reasons. The first is that, like many grab hitboxes in these Souls games, the hitbox is just a little bit janky and sometimes hit you when it really shouldn't have, in my opinion. The other problem with this is I feel like it does a little bit too much damage. To clarify, this is subjective since you can obviously come back in here at any point with whatever Shadow Tree blessing you want and take varying amounts of damage, but the way which he burns you, impales you on his spear, and then does additional burn damage just feels a bit mean. Especially if you barely survive the impaling part but then die from the fire. Then again, if you're able to avoid being shitboxed, the attack isn't too hard to dodge and gives you a guaranteed punish window. Lots of his attacks do that, in fact, maybe even all of them. Even his signature combo with the spear AoE at the end leaves him sitting for a couple seconds, which is the perfect time to take a heal or get in a couple hits. Once you get Mesmer to half health, he goes through a phase transition and a cutscene that makes me squirm every time I see it. Thank God for skippable cutscenes, you could learn from this, Nintendo. Somehow I personally find Phase 2 to be easier than Phase 1. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like he attacks less often and his attacks are easier to dodge. He seems to take more damage and he also leaves longer punish windows. I can't confirm any of these for certain, but it really feels that way to me, and it would make sense since the dude pretty much blinds himself in the transition cutscene. That last part is especially true with his serpent attacks, which are surprisingly forgiving. First time I saw them, I had war flashbacks to the Shadows of Yharnam from Bloodborne and how awful their huge snake attacks were, but thankfully I think Mesmer uses these in a much fairer way. The only real additions to his moveset are a spin that he'll usually do at the end of most combos, and a new variation of his signature combo that incorporates snake attacks into it. Once you defeat Mesmer, you get a key item that allows you to progress the DLC by burning the Sealing Tree located at the end of the ancient ruins of Ra. I'm going to include this region in this section of the video because there honestly isn't much here aside from the Dancing Lion refight, another Hippo, another Furnace Golem, and the boss of this area, Ramina, Saint of the Bud. Before we get to Ramina, I want to talk about this region briefly because I honestly don't really like it that much. It's really pretty, but for the most part, you basically go in and out of this maze of ruins inside the cliffside until you manage to find your way to cross along a bridge path to the boss, and honestly, every room here looks so similar it's easy to get lost, and not enough way that's fun to explore in my opinion. Not only that, but there are 4 different Shadow Tree fragments in this region. One from the Hippo, one from a random pot shadow, one just sitting on the ground, and one from the cross. Aside from that, and the enemies that I mentioned earlier, there really isn't much to this area, so let's go ahead and dive into Ramina. Ramina is probably my third favorite boss in Shadow of the Erdtree, and Elden Ring as a whole by extension, only slightly behind the Dancing Lion and Mesmer, which I can't believe I'm saying considering that she's themed around Scarlet Rot. She's essentially this game's version of Quelaag and Najka, and in my opinion she's definitely the best of the 3 by a wide margin. Despite several of her attacks inflicting a Scarlet Rot buildup, I've rarely had an attempt against her where that actually affected me. The only exception to that is her grab attack, which is guaranteed to inflict a full proc of Scarlet Rot, but that attack is heavily telegraphed and easily dodged, and even then, it doesn't immediately end the fight if you do get hit by it. Ramina is also incredible in the context of Elden Ring because she had clear and consistent punish windows. She has no combos where, after the combo seems to be over, she decides to jump away and give you the middle finger while hitting you for thinking you had learned a pattern. That doesn't happen unlike several other bosses in this game, and I love her for that. Just like Mesmer, she also has an attack where she flies into the air, and the moment to dodge is telegraphed via a bright red flash. She has a variant of this move in Phase 2, where instead of slamming on the ground, she swings with her pole blade 3 times, but she charges it up enough to where it would be very difficult to confuse the two. My only real problem with this fight is during her phase transition, where she immediately begins creating a Scarlet Rot vortex around her. If you're playing melee, this will deal unavoidable damage to you. I don't think it's too bad since it doesn't do a ton of damage, but it is an instance of unavoidable damage that needs to be mentioned. Then again, you could also just be playing a ranged character. Aside from that, I think she's yet another example of the step up in boss quality that this DLC has in a lot of areas, something that I'm very happy to be able to say. Behind her is the Sealing Tree to enter Ilum, which you can only burn if you've defeated Mesmer, because you can technically fight her before Mesmer if you explore, but it is what it is. Before we proceed to the game's final legacy dungeon, I think it's time we get to all of that we'll talk about it later stuff that I've mentioned so many times throughout the script. Let's start with the Stone Coffin Fissure, which is an area at the southernmost point of the Cerulean Coast region. There are two main ways to get to the Cerulean Coast. The first one is by climbing down some coffins next to a waterfall, which I suspect not a lot of people are going to know about. And the second one is by going past the Grand Altar of Dragon Communion after exiting the Dragon's Pit, which is how I first found it. The first time I got to this area was actually before I made it to the Shadowkeep for the first time, and so I was met with a barrier upheld by Miquella's Great Rune. It was a really interesting way of telling me, you're not ready for this yet, and as soon as the message that a Great Rune broke appeared before me, I immediately thought back to that area and wondered if the barrier was gone. Sure enough it was, and I was able to enter the Stone Coffin Fissure. This area made my jaw drop at first. My immediate reaction was wondering if FromSoft decided to make another underground map for this DLC like they did in the base game. In reality, they didn't create anything on the same scale as Sealfur River or Ainsel River, but the Stone Coffin Fissure is still a decently sized area. I'm not sure if I would call it a legacy dungeon or not, but it's a relatively linear area with a good bit of platforming that ends with a boss, so I wouldn't be surprised to see some people refer to it as one. As for the area itself, I really enjoyed it the first time I went through, but my subsequent playthroughs I found myself enjoying it less and less. Which is odd considering I came back there with a much higher Shadow Tree blessing on those later playthroughs. A lot of this is due to the stone caterpillar enemies taking notes from the Anor Londo archers and sniping you constantly from halfway across the fucking map. Combine that with the other stone caterpillars whacking you while you're trying to kill the snipers, along with many deathbirds making life miserable, this area is a chore to get through in my opinion. It also has a random Leonine Misbegotten toward the end for some reason that I really don't understand. It drops a new incantation, but I really don't know why they couldn't have just given it to an invading NPC or just had it on the ground somewhere. All of what I've said so far about this area would probably make it seem like I hated it, but the Stone Coffin Fissure's quality is brought up significantly by its boss. The Putrescent Knight found at the bottom of a long drop into a totally not Dark Eater Medeer style arena is one of the best bosses in the DLC in my opinion. They essentially brought Orphan of Kos back from the dead, gave him a makeover and a horse, and let him loose to wreck your shit. Once again, and I hate that this is something I have to praise now instead of it being the standard, but that's Elden Ring for you, the Putrescent Knight's attacks are all predictable and preventable without exception. Almost all of these attacks leave an opportunity to punish the boss, making a really fun back and forth match, especially as the Knight rides back and forth to try and hit you. The only thing in this fight that I'm not a huge fan of is his second phase Ghost Flame attacks, since the hitboxes can be a tiny bit janky, but they can all be dodged mostly consistently by jumping over them. It's honestly really hard for me to find things to say about this boss because it's really just solid all around. Along with the Dancing Lion, Mesmer, and Romina, I think the Putrescent Knight also stands alongside the best bosses in previous FromSoft games in terms of both quality and challenge. I could honestly see this fight fitting in perfectly in both Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. Despite my praise for the boss itself, the reward it gives isn't really that great. While the Dancing Lion gives you one of the best armor pieces in the game, Rolana, Mesmer, and Romina get progression through the DLC, the Putrescent Knight only hides Saint Trina, an NPC that, if you talk to, just straight up kills you. The first time this happened to me, I laughed out loud and said to myself, okay FromSoft, what area am I going to be taken to now that the NPC has killed me, only for it to respawn me at the nearby site of Grace with nothing having changed whatsoever. In hindsight, I know that this NPC is part of one of the DLC's many NPC quest lines, and that it's very important to Miquella's lore, but from a gameplay perspective, this reward was very disappointing. A sad end to an area that I find to be okay overall, with a decent area, amazing boss, and a disappointing reward. The Shadow Tree base, despite having its own area title card, really just serves as the boss arena for the Shadow Tree avatar, who's another one of my favorite bosses in this expansion. I feel like that opinion might be a bit controversial since I've seen several mixed opinions about it online. Personally, I think the Shadow Tree avatar stands alongside the previously aforementioned bosses as an amazing boss and one of the best bosses in the entire Souls series. I've seen some complaints about this boss, some saying that it's too easy and some saying that it's too hard, but honestly, I think that the difficulty, when not factoring in the Shadow Tree Blessing variants, is perfect, and that the boss could stand right alongside the best of Dark Souls 3. The only problematic attack is his Phase 3 explosion, but all you have to do to properly dodge it is back up enough to dodge the initial explosion, then roll when it goes off to dodge the Rays of Light, and that's about it. Most of the attacks in this fight can be addressed by positioning yourself in relation to the attacks. There's pretty major issues in this regard that aren't exclusive to this Erdtree avatar, but we'll get to that when we talk about the final boss. I also want to mention how in Phase 3 the music swells and gets a lot more somber, and I really enjoy that. It really tells a story about how this realm and this avatar are slowly but surely dying, and I think that the set piece here is absolutely incredible. Meta is a boss that I'm fairly mixed on, all things considered. Compared to the other bosses in both the base game and the DLC, she's not inherently bad, and I honestly think she would fit right at home in Bloodborne alongside its larger beast bosses. However, before we get to the actual fight, I do have some criticisms to make about the questline leading up to it. Firstly, the finger ruins that you visit as part of this questline were massively disappointing in my opinion. The first time that I saw one from the base of the jagged peak, way down in a valley, I genuinely thought, oh, that's going to be an important area that probably has a boss in the middle. I go there, and there's nothing. You have to go to the Cathedral of Monosmeter first in order to get a whistle, then you blow it, and you just get a talisman. Secondly, the leech enemies that are in these finger ruins that you need to get to in order to fight the boss are some of the most unfun enemies that I've ever fought in these games, considering that no matter how fast you're going, and with Torrent's lack of iframes, you are most likely going to get hit by their paralyzing attack, and you just have to sit there and wait to be able to get back up. There's little to no skill involved here, and it's just a matter of if you get lucky enough to avoid them. Thankfully, by the time you're exploring these ruins, you'll probably have a good few Erdtree blessings under your belt, so the leeches themselves don't do a ton of damage, but they're still extremely annoying. Meta herself suffers from having some of the most janky hitboxes I've ever seen in Elden Ring. That's not a problem exclusive to her, and one boss in particular in this DLC is much worse, but the lack of telegraphs combined with the shitty hitboxes on certain attacks can feel a bit bullshit at times. Some of the worst attacks from this boss include the attack where she thrusts her fingers out from the sides, and an animation that I'm just shy of calling unreactable. There's also the attack where she revs up her side fingers to do several stomps in a row. This one in particular does insane damage, and if you aren't prepared for it, can kill you almost instantly. I really don't like this attack. Her second phase attack where she summons an orbital laser that circles around from above her, I don't know if I'm just bad at the game, but I have never been able to dodge the first laser of this attack. Whether I roll into it, run away from it, it's probably an issue on my end in all honesty, but I still really don't like it. Her attack in phase 2 where she levitates in the air while spinning only to slam down like a Beyblade to hit you. This attack can actually hit you twice in a row despite the hitbox only making contact with you once. She can ascend on top of your character to deal damage, then spin as she moves along the ground to deal more damage, and even at Erdtree Blessing level 20, this attack is still capable of one-shotting the player. While that may seem like a lot, I don't actively dislike Meta either. I think that she's a really cool set-piece boss and isn't too bullshit hard in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to other bosses we'll get to. Most of the attacks I mentioned likely won't kill you if you're keeping your health up properly or properly positioning yourself between attacks. It's not my favorite boss, but not bad either. I'd probably put it in low A tier or high B tier. I do especially like her implications on the lore of the DLC, but I'm not really here to talk about the lore, that's a job for other YouTube videos. If there's one thing that I absolutely need to praise about Shadow of the Erdtree as a whole, it would have to be the sense of exploration and just how unique some of the areas in this expansion are. Nowhere is that exemplified further than the Abyssal Woods and their boss, Midra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame. For one, this area is incredibly hidden. Arguably a bit too hidden, but with in-game messages and online guides, I feel like most players will be able to find this eventually. There's also an item right next to the ladder that will eventually lead to this area, so maybe I'm just being a bit too harsh on it. You have to go down a relatively hidden ladder in the Shadow Keep and pass through an illusory wall, make your way to a catacomb dungeon that goes further down the further you get into it, only to emerge in the Abyssal Woods after defeating the boss of that catacomb dungeon. Said boss isn't much to write home about, the ganking in the fight isn't great, but it doesn't last that long, so it's not really worth writing home about in my opinion. The main gimmick of the Abyssal Woods is that Torrent is unavailable throughout the entire area. The message you see when trying to use Torrent, the spectral steed is afraid and can't be summoned, really sets the tone for what this area is going to be about, stealth and horror. Throughout this area are the returning Winter Lanterns from Bloodborne and a new Eldritch Abomination form that can't be killed unless you hit a perfect parry on them, though in the sections where there are multiple of them, that may be impossible or ill-advised. In my experience, I was able to kill one of them and then would get killed by the other, but thankfully they stay dead if you manage to kill them by parrying, so it's not too bad. Since you can't kill these Winter Lanterns normally, and they're also capable of running faster than you and killing you instantly with madness, the solution then is to use stealth by sneaking around the tall grass to make it past these things. Their vision can be a little bit finicky at times, especially in this one part of the woods where there's fog everywhere and Winter Lanterns are inside it, so you can't see them, but they can still see you. Aside from that one instance, I love this area as a proof of concept that the Eldritch Horror from Bloodborne wasn't just a one-off instance, and I think that the new improved Winter Lanterns are a great way to evoke that. Eventually, after making your way southward through the woods, you'll finally make it to the legacy dungeon of this area at Midra's Manse, and honestly, it's kind of disappointing in my opinion. With how unique that the entire Abyssal Woods area is, I was very surprised to find that there were no unique enemies within this dungeon, not even the Winter Lanterns who are outside. It's a bit of a shame, but it's honestly made up for by the boss itself. Midra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame, is in my opinion the sixth and final boss of this expansion that I think is absolutely excellent, one of the best bosses in Elden Ring and in the Soulsborne series as a whole. From what I could tell, every single attack that Midra has is well telegraphed and capable of being reasonably dodged. Again, I hate that's something I need to praise now, but it's still good to point out. I only have two problems with this fight from a game design perspective, and one of those is honestly not that bad in and of itself and is mostly a skill issue. The problem is that if Midra is able to proc Madness on you during the fight, you're pretty much dead, since Madness does a decent chunk of damage and also keeps you locked in place for a few seconds, giving Midra the opportunity to hit you with a follow-up that will most likely kill you. It does feel a little unfair when it does happen, but this is one of the few instances in Elden Ring where I think the phrase "get good" actually applies well, because it encourages you to learn his attack patterns so that he doesn't end up proccing Madness in the first place. The second problem is something I'm convinced is a glitch, and while it doesn't happen every time, it happens often enough to where it made me raise an eyebrow about the way the fight is designed. When Mitra transitions into Phase 2 of his fight, technically Phase 3 if you want to count the little guy at the beginning as a phase, but I really don't care. It's kind of stupid you have to fight him every time, but that's neither here nor there. He rises up into the air and slams down with a big fiery madness explosion. Most of the time the attack ends there, and if you dodge it, you have the opportunity to run in after it's finished to get a hit or two on him to start off this phase. The problem is that sometimes, but not all the time, Midra can almost immediately fire a madness laser once his explosion is finished, and unlike the regular version of this attack, this one has no telegraph and comes out instantly. I'm unsure if this is intentional or not, but I'm confident that it's some sort of glitch since it didn't happen every time. On my later playthroughs that I did after a couple patches came out for this DLC, he hasn't done it once, so who knows, this may have already been patched out, it may have been officially called a glitch, I'm not entirely sure. If this was intentional, then I think it's a pretty big problem with the fight. Aside from those two relatively minor issues with the fight though, Midra is absolutely incredible in terms of presentation and difficulty. If you come in with too high of a Shadow Tree blessing, he can be a bit on the easier side, but he's still fun no matter what, and at the end of the day, fun is what matters most in my opinion. Unfortunately, this is the end of the section where a lot of my praise for Shadow of the Erdtree lies. I still have some things that I really like about it that I'll get to when they come up, but the final three bosses that I've yet to talk about contain my biggest issues with the DLC, and they really make me worried about the direction the series is going, considering one of them is the final boss, and another is a boss that people online are praising a lot. With that being said, let's get into why this DLC casts a dark shadow on FromSoft's future, in my opinion. I've already talked a little bit about the Jagged Peak before during the section on base game enemy reuse, but just to reiterate, when climbing up the Jagged Peak, you will encounter 3 separate reused dragon enemies and 1 reused ancient dragon enemy. And aside from those, the only enemies on this mountain are those tiny little blob enemies that aren't very interesting and you can just run past with your horse. It may seem like I really don't like Jagged Peak, but that actually couldn't be further from the truth. I think that scaling the Jagged Peak might just be the single best piece of exploration that FromSoft has ever done, and even better than the numerous instances of that in the base game. This shit feels like you're climbing Mount Doom from Lord of the Rings, and with the red lightning getting more and more intense as you climb up, seeing 2 dragons fighting each other, it's genuinely one of the few times that I would unironically describe something like this as epic. Which is why it's a shame that this area ends with a really shitty boss, in my opinion. This will likely be the hottest take of my entire script. I do not care for Bale the Dread. Compared to the other 2 bosses I haven't spoken of yet, I do think that he's better than them, but otherwise I'm extremely mixed on this boss, and I feel like I'm insane for feeling that way. All over the internet, I keep hearing people say that Bale is the best boss in the CLC, and I'm sorry, but I just don't agree. People are comparing him to Dark Eater Midir from Dark Souls 3, so I literally played through the entirety of Dark Souls 3 again to see if they were accurate, and I'm sorry, but no, they're not. They're just not. They share a few attacks, and that's it. I feel like the base game of Elden Ring has gaslit people into thinking that this kind of boss design is okay, and that I'm being anti-gaslit for not enjoying this boss. For me, Bale has three major problems that all culminate into making him one of my least favorite bosses in this DLC. The first is shitty hitboxes and attack telegraphs, the second is the classic when the hell is it my turn to attack issue, and the third is that he's boring. The last point has an important asterisk next to it that we'll get to later, but for now I want to go over every single attack that Bale has to explain the hitbox issues, with attack names that are coming from Fextra Life. Fatal Bites. Unlike a lot of grab attacks in this game, I think Bale's grab attack is fine. It's decent telegraph, doesn't have any follow-up. The hitbox can be a bit janky, but compared to his other attacks, I think it's fine. This one gets a pass from me. Fatal Stomp. This attack involves Bale flying up into the air for a few seconds before falling down to land on top of you. This one is similar to ones that Mesmer and Ramina have where they fly up in the sky to slam down, but with one key difference. There is no visual telegraph for where to dodge. This won't be the last time I say this during this point in the video, but I feel like the team who designed bosses like Mesmer and Ramina were not the same people who designed Bale and the other two bosses I haven't talked about yet. The attack itself is fine, but it's really frustrating that it doesn't have a visual telegraph like the other attacks of this same kind in the DLC. I really don't like this one. Sweeping Lightning Breath. The hitbox in this attack can be a bit janky, but rolling through it from right to left should let you avoid damage most of the time. This one gets a pass from me. Downward Lightning Breath. Bale will only use this attack if you're staying too close to him for too long. The attack itself has a decent telegraph and doesn't do a ton of damage if it hits you, so I'd say it's fine in a vacuum. We'll come back to this later when I discuss problem number 3 about Bale. Beam Lightning Breath. This attack involves Bale breathing a stream of fire at you that tracks your movement for a few seconds. It usually takes about 3 rolls to dodge in my experience. I am convinced that the hitbox on this attack is broken. This is one of the attacks that Bale can use immediately as soon as you enter the arena, and every time he did so, I would, without fail, get hit, even if I dodged at what should have been the right time. I've heard elsewhere online that his fire bounces off the walls of the arena, and while I'm not sure how true that is, if it is true, then the fact that Bale can start off the fight with this attack while you're entering from the side of the arena is complete bullshit unavoidable damage. Outside of the start of the fight, though, this attack is fine. Lightning Spear. This is a classic Elden Ring spring load attack where he charges up for a few seconds and then lets it rip instantly. This one is fine and consistently dodgeable in my experience, so this one gets a thumbs up from me. Lightning Smite. This attack is when Bale roars at the player, which itself does damage, which I really don't like since several other types of this roar attack just knock you back, and I don't really understand why this one does damage all of a sudden. When Bale roars, he causes several lightning bolts to follow and strike the player for a few seconds. This attack is fine in a vacuum, but if you're attacking his leg and he uses this, there's a good chance that his body hitbox will get you stuck between his stomach and his leg, making this attack impossible to dodge. We'll also come back to this attack when we get to problem number 3. Lunging Claw Stab. This attack involves Bale lunging from a mid to long distance away to hit you with his claw. A lot of times if you try to punish this, he'll immediately follow up with another attack, one that will likely stun you, and if you do dodge that follow-up, it prevents you from getting a hit in. I really don't like this one. Lunging Bite Multi-Attack. This is the only attack in Bale's arsenal where I can agree with the comparison to Dark Eater Midir's moveset from Dark Souls 3. Bale lunges towards you and bite twice. Unlike Midir, however, who would give the player a guaranteed opportunity to either hit him or heal, Bale will always follow this attack up with some sort of follow-up. In my experience, it's usually his downward breath attack. I'm really not a fan of it, and I really think this shows how ill-advised the comparison between Bale and Midir is. Lunging Stab Multi-Attack. Here, Bale will swipe twice with his wings before attacking with a Lightning Spear move. In his second phase, this attack also gets a follow-up lightning trail to it. In phase 1, this attack is fine, but I'm not a big fan of it in phase 2, since if you dodge the attack in the same way you dodged it in phase 1, you'll likely get hit by the follow-up lightning bolts. I really don't like that it punishes learning the attack patterns. That's just fucked up in my opinion. Tail Swipe. Bale will use this when the player is behind him, similar to Dark Eater Midir, where he'll turn around and swipe his tail to deal damage at the player and return facing them. He can also jump past the player, then jump back toward them with this attack, meaning that he can essentially use it from neutral. I'm really not a fan of this attack, and honestly, it was really hard for me to try and punish this one, but maybe that's just a skill issue. Bale's Tyranny. This is Bale's phase transition attack. He'll start charging up for an explosion with several delayed lava explosions rising from the ground. When he begins activating this, both upon phase change and randomly in phase 2, it's a pretty long telegraph, so it's fine to know when to dodge. This attack is alright in my opinion. Dive Bomb. This is the second part of Bale's phase transition attack. After his initial explosion, Bale will fly up into the sky and shoot several fireballs at you before sweeping down for a dive bomb explosion attack. First of all, this attack takes fucking forever, and this would be fine if this is the only time he used it, but he also pulls this out whenever he wants during phase 2. Not only that, but the timing on the dodge for his dive bomb part is incredibly delayed, and I honestly wouldn't be shocked if the hitbox was proven to be broken. As far as I can tell, you are unable to roll or run past it to the side. You have to iframe it, which requires a very precise timing for the roll. I really don't like this attack. Flying Strafe. In my opinion, this is Bale's worst attack. Bale will fly up into the air and breathe down fire that will sweep across the arena horizontally. Dodging this part of the attack feels super weird, and jumping it doesn't work either in my experience. After that, Bale follows up with a direct sweep of fire that also comes with an explosion after trail. The dodge method for this attack is so fucking awful that I'm convinced it was an oversight by FromSoft. You are flat out unable to dodge this attack to the side and avoid the fire and explosion like common sense would dictate. Instead, you're intended to roll into the fire to properly iframe through the attack, and then roll again to iframe through the explosion. Not only is this completely counterintuitive to common fucking sense, half the time it doesn't even fucking work. And the cherry on top of it all is that Bale is completely unable to be hit during this attack, and you're unable to get any sort of punish on him at all afterwards because you'll most likely not be next to him when the attack is over, and even if you are, he's immediately going to begin the next attack, which we'll get more into when we get to the second major problem. Dreadful Lightning Spear. This is Bale's equivalent to Placidus Axe's Lightning Nuke attack. This attack is fairly easy to dodge with both visual and audio cues, but even if you don't, the attack just doesn't do a lot of damage in my opinion. At least every time I've been hit by it, I was able to heal it up with a single Crimson Flask. Apparently you can also iframe through this attack, which feels kind of weird to me. Like, of all the attacks to iframe through, I really wouldn't have expected this one to be iframeable, personally. And that is every single attack that Bale the Dread can use against the player. Almost every single one has some sort of hitbox problem, and what's worse is that Bale will just keep using these attacks over and over again with very little room for punish, which is a perfect way to transition to my next problem with Bale, the classic Elden Ring, when the fuck is it my turn to attack? One of the biggest problems with the base game of Elden Ring is that toward the end of the game, some bosses simply will not stop attacking. Some bosses use this fine, like Malekith, since he's a glass cannon that does have proper punish windows while he's attacking, but others do not, such as Elden Beast and Melania. The changes to the boss design in the last third of the base game was one of the biggest complaints that many critics had with it. Thankfully, I'm happy to report that a good number of the bosses in this DLC do not suffer from this issue. The 6 bosses I mentioned loving earlier all have predictable and preventable attacks with small but excusable hiccups, with opportunities to punish after most of their attacks. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Bale the Dread. From the moment you enter the arena, Bale will instantly attack you, either with his Fire Breath beam or with one of his lunging attacks, and from there he never lets up. What's worse is that only some of his attacks have proper punish windows, and they are very short. People online keep comparing Bale to Midir, and I'm sorry, but that's just incorrect in my opinion. They share 2 attacks, and that's it. Plus, Midir's version of those 2 attacks do leave proper punish windows, but Bale's do not, and I think that exemplifies the biggest problem with this boss. Another commonality that Bale and Midir share is that the true boss fight is actually the camera. Both bosses only have one lock-on point, that being their head, and because of how relentlessly both of them attack, and how close range you are if you're playing melee, the camera will constantly be whipping around in both fights. With Midir, it's a bit much, but after every attack he'll stop for a few seconds, both to give the player the chance to get a hit or two in, and to give the camera a goddamn rest. Bale, to put it simply, does not do this, and it makes the fight significantly more disorienting because of it. Clearly both fights intend for you to focus your attacks mostly on the head, since it's the only lock-on point for both of them. This works for Midir since, once again, he has consistent punish windows, and if you focus all of your attacks on Midir's head, then at around 20% health he'll become vulnerable to a guaranteed stagger opportunity that will either instantly kill him or leave him with barely any health so that you can just take him out immediately after. Bale does not do either of these. This leads me to the biggest problem I have with Bale the Dread. If the bullshit hitboxes and unrelenting attacks weren't enough, since he has such inconsistent attack windows, the player can sometimes go for nearly a minute without being able to hit him. In my second playthrough of the DLC, I played through almost all of it using the new martial arts weapon class, and up until fighting Bale, I was having a lot of fun with them. But with Bale, the martial arts simply do not have the range to consistently hit his head after attacks. This led to Bale staying out of my range for most of the fight, which in turn made the fight boring. Even if you're using a decently ranged weapon, which I did in my third playthrough with the Melody-like Greatsword, he will spend so much time flying around the arena to the point where you aren't able to hit him consistently. This gets even worse in Phase 2, when 2 of his attacks have him flying in the air out of melee range, and 2 other attacks have Bale force you into mid-range, and by the time that attack is over, he's already started using another one. In my second playthrough, all of these design decisions combined left me with a three-way choice. I could either continue fighting the way the game wanted me to with a weapon that didn't work for the boss fight, I could change my build to accommodate the boss fight, or I could play unlocked and hit him wherever I could manage. The first option made the fight incredibly boring. The second option is something we'll talk about more when discussing the final boss, and the third option simply made the fight too easy, aka another flavor of boring. If you're having trouble with Bale, here's my advice. Go for his leg and tail instead of his head. If you do this, he only has 2 attacks that will consistently hit you, his Downward Flame Breath and his Lightning Scream. In Phase 2, you can also add his 2 large explosion attacks to this list as well. However, these attacks, if you are coming in properly leveled for this fight, simply don't do enough damage to disincentivize this strategy. In my winning attempt during my second playthrough, I accidentally exploited his AI to where he simply stayed in one corner and let me wail on him with my jump attacks, only using the Downward Breath and Lightning attacks to hit me, which I was just able to heal off anyway. The fight became way too easy and thus was anticlimactically boring. In my third playthrough, using the Light Greatsword Melody, I tried to do what I thought the fight was intending. I focused mostly on the head, but then the fight became boring in the opposite way, since he just kept going out of range and preventing me from getting consistent punishes. So, I resorted to the Grug and spammed heavy attacks on his legs until he died. I understand that there's a lot to like about this boss. The presentation and lead up to the boss is absolutely incredible, and Egon, the NPC summon for this fight, is absolutely iconic and will go down in Soulsborne history as one of the most iconic NPCs in these games alongside Siegmeyer/Siegward, Henri, and of course, Solaire Vestora. But, in my opinion, the actual fight itself is just a slog of unfair boredom. Overall, I think Egon summarizes my thoughts perfectly.
Curse you, Bale!
Up next is mine and many others' vote for the worst remembrance boss in this DLC, Commander Gaius. To refer back to way earlier in the video, this is the boss that I mentioned earlier that locks 10% of the Erdtree fragments behind him. If this was a fun fight, then I'd be absolutely fine with this. I'd rather go out of my way to get these shadow fragments because I want to do it rather than because I have to. Unfortunately, Commander Gaius might be the single worst case of broken hitboxes in FromSoft history, to the point where I genuinely wonder if they play-tested this fight at all. It's pretty clear to me that this fight was intended to be done using Torrent, considering that's the only Remembrance boss in this DLC that allows you to use him, and yet there are 2 major problems with that. Firstly is something I've mentioned several times throughout this video, the fact that Torrent still doesn't have any iframes even 2 years after the game's release. I feel like they tried to balance this a little bit with the Revered Spirit Ashes, which apparently increased Torrent's health, but you can forgive me for not noticing all of that in my first playthrough despite getting all of them for the final boss to power up my Mimic tier. Again, we'll get to that. Because having all the health in the world doesn't matter if enemies are still going to knock you off your horse in 2 or 3 hits. The second reason that Torrent isn't great for this fight is because Gaius will always be faster than Torrent, meaning that it's impossible to outrun him, meaning that if you are fighting on Torrent, you are going to get hit. This fight is blatantly unfair if you're trying to go about it in the way the game wants you to. I'd say this is more of a problem with Torrent than it is with Gaius, so let's try fighting him without Torrent. Every time you enter the Fog Gate to fight Gaius, he will always begin by charging at the player. This might straight up be the worst hitbox in the entire game. If you are using a medium load, you straight up cannot dodge this attack to the side in time to avoid taking damage. You can try to dodge through him using iframes, but 1, that's counterintuitive against all common sense, and 2, half the time it doesn't fucking work. We'll talk more about medium load builds when we get to the final boss, but this makes me absolutely fucking furious. Gaius shares the same problem that Bale and several other bosses in the base game of Elden Ring do, in that they can spend a good portion of the fight away from the player, with several ranged attacks where all you can do is just sit there and wait for him to let you hit him. However, that isn't even the worst thing that Commander Gaius can do. As you just saw, Gaius is able to do an entire combo and then instantly transition into a charge in response to you trying to get an attack in. This boss is literally the definition of fucking bullshit, and I genuinely cannot believe that they thought this guy was good enough not only to make into a remembrance boss, but also to lock 10% of the DLC's progression upgrades behind. And yet, even though Gaius is easily the worst boss in this DLC, he is not the one who pisses me off the most. I think that it's finally time for us to enter the final dungeon and address the demigod in the room. Enter Ilum, the final legacy dungeon of Shadow of the Erdtree, is one that I really wanted to enjoy, but there are just too many things that make it more tedious than it is fun. After you're teleported there, a decision which I still don't understand, why the fuck would you do this FromSoft, most of the enemies in this first area are Hornsent Inquisitors, who aren't too hard, and while they aren't exclusive to this area, they fit it fine, so it's whatever. The problematic parts come with the only unique enemies to this area, the stronger versions of the Horned Warriors that appear. Other versions of this enemy have appeared throughout the DLC, but what makes these ones different is that they take on different elements from the Dancing Lion boss fight, which only further adds to my sense of why the hell is the Dancing Lion optional. The first one you find here isn't too bad. It's imbued with Dancing Lion's lightning ability, so I'm surprised that I don't hate him more, but he's fine. What I do hate are the Hornsent Shamans on the staircase that summon circlets of light underneath you. There are easier versions of this enemy in Bellarat, but here the circles come out so fast that even if you're running, you are very likely to get stunlocked by them. Even compared to the Elder Inquisitor Jory that you fight in the entrance to the Abyssal Woods, these are still way faster. I really hate these enemies. After that is a Site of Grace, but I do also want to point out that this area of Enter Ilum has, in my opinion, the worst Shadow Tree fragment in the game. Having to double back from this Site of Grace, drop down several small sets of geometry that do not look like they should be walkable, only to drop further down back into Bellarat to grab it. There's also a unique weapon at the end of this section that, if that was the only reward, I would be fine with. But locking a Shadow Tree fragment behind this is just mean in my opinion, especially since you'll want to be max Shadow Blessing level for the final boss. The average player simply will not be able to find this without a guide. Unfortunately though, it gets worse. The run from the Spiral Rise Site of Grace to the Cleansing Chamber Anteroom Site of Grace might be the most brutal run in the entire game, with no Stake of America to break it up to be more manageable. In order, this section of the dungeon involves facing a swarm of mini Deathbirds, followed by a Frost-Horned Warrior, who's awful to fight in my opinion. The Frost AoE attacks that leave a flurry that does damage over time are just fucking awful. Followed by more Inquisitors, before another Horned Warrior that is imbued with Storm attacks. Fighting all of these in a row is a lot, and I honestly expected there to be a Stake of America at the beginning of the Long Bridge with the Wind-Horned Warrior, but for now, the best way to go about it is just to run past everything, which is a sign of incredible design, of course. From there, we get to the first boss fight of Enter Ilum. I call it a boss because even if it doesn't have a proper health bar, this is a required fight that has so much health in total that it may as well be a boss.
Don't you dare approach Mikula the Kind. Needle Knight's Ledder, Dryleaf Dane, and our allies will never allow this.
Needle Knight Leda and her allies will go down in Soul's history as one of the worst gank fights in the entire series. A lot of the difficulty in this fight comes from whether or not you completed many of the NPC side quests during this DLC, and with how cryptic FromSoft questlines can be, this fight can become very hectic very quickly. This fight basically requires you to use summons, because with the amount of health that these NPC fighters have, if you're doing it solo, you're going to get double, triple, or even quadruple teamed by these guys. Without summons, this fight is a 2-on-1 at best, or a 6-on-1 at worst, at least according to the research I did. There are 6 total NPCs that can appear as enemies in this fight. Leda and Dane will always be hostile, while the rest depend on how you interact with them in different questlines. The first time I got to this fight, I had to do a 3-on-1 against Leda, Dane, and Hornsent. In my second playthrough, I summoned Hornsent at the very end of the Mesmer fight and didn't interact with him from there, so I only had to fight Leda and Dane. In my third playthrough, this fight was a 4-on-1 against Leda, Dane, Hornsent, and more, the last of which I genuinely fucking hate. Moore is a nice merchant that you meet toward the beginning of the DLC who, after Miquella's charm is broken, will begin having an existential crisis. If you tell him to put it behind him, like a sane person would do, he becomes hostile in this fight. So the only way to avoid having him join the fight is to either never talk to him, which I did in my first playthrough, or tell him to be sad forever as a dialogue choice after the charm breaks. The other two NPCs that can be part of this fight are Ansbach and Freya, both of whom I barely interacted with in my first 3 playthroughs, but did go out of my way to talk to in my 4th one. And if you do take the approach that I did in my first 3 playthroughs, neither of them will appear on either side. By doing certain NPC questlines, though, you can also get certain NPCs to join your side, including Hornsent, Talia, and Ansbach. There's also a random Sanguine Noble here to fight by your side as well. I'm not really a fan of this fight because if you don't use summons, the fight is way too stacked against you, but if you do use summons, especially Mimic tier, the fight becomes way too easy. I understand what FromSoft was trying to go for with this fight, and from a story perspective, I think it's really cool, but I personally think they didn't execute it well at all. With Leda and her allies defeated, all that's left between us and the end of the DLC is the final boss, who is coincidentally also the one that I have the most to say about. It's finally time to talk about Promised Consort Radahn.
My loyal blade and champion of the festival. Both your deeds will ever be praised in song. Now, the vow will be honored, and my lord brother's soul will return, so that he may be my consort.
My favorite boss in the base game of Elden Ring was Morgott the Omen King, but very close behind him for me was Starscourge Radahn. The lead up to fighting Radahn, along with the many ways to go about fighting him that were all varying degrees of fun or exciting, made him one of the most iconic bosses in FromSoft history. When I was spoiled on Radahn being the final boss of this DLC, I was initially confused. Why would they bring Radahn back? Would he be the same fight as the base game? Would they be able to recapture the magic of the original fight? Unfortunately, the answers to all 3 of those questions are, in order, it's complicated, no, and no. FromSoft has outdone themselves and somehow made a boss harder than Melania, making Radahn not only Miquella's lord, but also the lord of FromSoft difficulty. For talking about this fight, I want to start out with the positives because there is a lot about this fight to like. For one, the idea of fighting Radahn in his prime, something that people across the base game and the DLC spoke of, is a really cool concept, and this fight executes that concept very well, at least in Phase 1. Additionally, the music in this fight is absolutely fantastic, and is one of my favorite OSTs in the entire game. The entire presentation of this fight is absolutely immaculate. It's just a shame that the fight itself fails to deliver on that presentation in so many ways. This may be the hottest take that I say in this video, even more so than not liking Bale, but I truly believe that Promised Consort Radahn is an unfair fight, and that it was intentionally designed to be that way. To an extent, I understand why it would be designed this way. Compared to Elden Beast, the only other boss in the game that displays God slain upon defeat, Promised Consort Radahn truly feels like you're fighting a god, like the odds are stacked against you. Unfortunately for this fight though, those odds are stacked against you in a way that is much more tedious than it is fun. Just like with Bale, I want to go through every single attack that Promised Consort Radahn has in order to point out the problems with every single one of them, because I have several gripes with almost all of them. Gravity Cyclone. Radahn will usually open the fight with this attack, and it's not really too hard to dodge. Just rolling through it toward Radahn once is enough to dodge the entire thing, regardless of your equip load. I don't really have a problem with this one. Blood Flame Slash. This is the attack where Radahn will stab one of his swords in front of him, then slash it to the side to create a blood flame explosion. The initial stab and subsequent swipe are easy to dodge. The problem is that punishing this attack is a crapshoot because depending on where you dodge the slash, the explosion from the blood flame can still hit you and knock you down. The thing is though, it only does this sometimes. According to some people I've heard online, it's best to roll to the right for this attack if you want to punish, but I have no clue why it works this way. This is also one of Radahn's attacks that can be parried. The problem with parrying it is that sometimes, even if you get the perfect parry, the blood flame explosion will still occur, preventing you from getting any sort of punish from it. I really don't like this attack. Starcaller Cry. This attack involves Radahn doing a scream while sucking you in toward him. Rolling the initial gravity well will stop his attack right there. However, if you are hit by this attack, you are pulled right next to him. Most of the time he'll follow this up with a gravity slam, which can only be dodged by rolling backwards 2 to 3 times. Occasionally, he'll also follow up his gravity well with a double sword spin attack, which we'll talk about later. I have two problems with this attack. The first is that the initial gravity well does an inconsistent amount of damage if it hits you. Sometimes it will only do a tiny amount of damage that's fairly negligible, and other times it will deal a decent chunk that, if you are comboed afterwards, will likely kill you. My second problem is that whether you successfully dodge the initial gravity well or not, there is no proper way to punish this attack. Either you have to wait for him to do his next attack after dodging the gravity well, or you have to roll back several times and then wait for him to do another attack. I'm not a huge fan of this attack, even if it is fairly easy to dodge. The attack also comes out very quickly, though not to the point where it's unreactable. Meteor Summon. For this attack, Radahn plunges his swords into the ground, then shoots up into the air with several meteorites, which he shoots back towards you after a couple seconds in the air. This attack, along with its Phase 2 variation, is my least favorite attack that Radahn has. For one, each portion of the attack has a hitbox that's incredibly inconsistent. The first part where he plunges his swords into the ground will usually deal damage to you only if you're right next to him, but sometimes, even if you're a few steps away from him where you really shouldn't get hit, you will still take damage. The second part is even worse because if you dodge the initial plunge, he can launch towards you and still do damage, but only sometimes. There have been times in both my runs and in runs that I've seen online where Radahn's body literally clips through the character model during the launch part of his attack and doesn't do any damage whatsoever. The final part of the attack is worst of all because when he shoots the meteors at you, they are literally unable to be rolled from unless you are using a light equipment load. I know that you can run to the side to dodge these attacks and then jump at the very end, but when I've used that, I've had to deal with the inconsistent hitbox of the meteors. We'll come back to the equipment load problem once we've gone over all the Phase 1 attacks. 3 or 4 swing combo. This is Radahn's most basic attack, which has a few variants that are relatively easy to dodge. In 2 of these variants, he'll start off with a slash from his right sword followed by 2 delayed slashes from both swords. If you're close to him, he'll use the first variant of his attack, where he does an overhead slam into an AoE attack. This is the easiest attack of Radahn's to get a punish off, since you can usually iframe the dodge into the AoE relatively consistently. The second variant occurs after the 2 delayed slashes if you're further away from Radahn, where he'll do 2 spin attacks at you. These spin attacks can occasionally have a follow-up of a third spin attack that he will only do sometimes in response to you trying to get a punish after the second spin. The third variant of this attack actually comes earlier after the first swing of this combo, where instead of doing 2 delayed slashes, he'll instead swipe left then right with his left sword in a pretty easy to dodge combo. It's also worth noting that both the initial slash of this combo and the extra follow-up of the spin attack variant are able to be parried, though neither of them have the same problem that the Blood Flame slash does. Double slash into cross slash. This may be the most bullshit attack that Radahn has in his entire arsenal. Radahn will start with a slash from one sword followed immediately by a slash from another sword before doing a cross slash with both of them that sends out a shockwave. The cross slash is fine and relatively easy to dodge if you dodge inward. The problem comes from the double slash before that because I am convinced that it is impossible to consistently dodge this. In some of my attempts against this boss, it literally looks like one or both of his swords are fucking extending just to hit me. The few times I did manage to survive this combo without being hit once, I honestly couldn't tell you what it was that I did differently. It was pure fucking luck. The Extra Life wiki even says, quote, unclear how to consistently dodge both of the first slashes with medium roll, but I would even go further into applying that to light rolling as well. Again, once we're done going over his Phase 1 attacks, we'll talk about the equipment load problem. Launching Slash. For this attack, Radahn takes approximately 13 business days to slash from right to left before raising his swords up for a follow-up hit. This is my pick for the most unnaturally delayed attack in the entirety of Elden Ring, and for punishing dodging at a reasonable time, it does a shit ton of damage. Really not a fan of this one. Lion's Claw. When the player is relatively far away from Radahn, he has the chance to use his Lion's Claw attack, where he'll do a front flip attack at you that's really easy to dodge. He'll sometimes follow this up with the second flip without any rhyme or reason, and if you try to punish the first hit, you are almost certainly going to get hit by his follow-up. That is every single attack that Promised Consort Radahn can do during his first phase. I won't be going over these attacks a second time when going over his Phase 2 attacks, since a lot of Phase 2 attacks are just the same with holy follow-ups. Before we get into all of his second phase attacks, I want to finally go into another one of my biggest problems with this DLC. First, I want to play the following clip from Joseph Anderson's critique of Elden Ring from back in 2022.
Let's open this up with a question. There is obviously a right way to play games like this, in terms of build decisions, playstyles, and fighting strategies. These games are always built around this singular intended experience, and if you deviate from that type, then you are playing the game wrong, and your time with it is invalidated. My question to you is, what playstyle is that? The answer is a melee build with no spells. No, it's whatever you have fun with. So then why is my biggest issue with the game related to this? Well, simply put, Elden Ring made me feel like I was playing the game wrong, and that my playstyle and choices that I used for all the other games in this series were no longer valid.
That clip was Anderson's biggest critique with the base game of Elden Ring, and one that I somewhat disagreed with in the context of the base game. Unfortunately, when it comes to Shadow of the Erdtree, I feel that this criticism from him rings true. Going into the DLC for the first time, I went in with a medium load build using the Moonlight Greatsword and some cool armor that I'd found. I fully intended on changing this build slightly to use one of the new weapon classes, so that's not the problem. The problem is that there are so many attacks in this DLC that straight up cannot be dodged via rolling unless you are using a light equipment load. This is especially a problem for people using colossal weapons, since a huge part of their build is completely invalidated. Promise Consort Radahn exhibits this problem the worst, but Bale and Gaius also have the same problem with several of their attacks as well. Don't misunderstand my point though, players should be willing to adjust their build to overcome challenges in these games. It's a big part of what makes them fun in my opinion. The problem comes from when players are forced to do so if they want to have a fair fight with some of these bosses, which popped up for me several times during my playthrough of this DLC. Sure, you can brute force these bosses with medium or heavy equipment loads, but you are actively handicapping yourself if you do because of the way FromSoft designed these bosses. This is even worse when paired with the same problem that made Malenia such a frustrating boss in the base game, and that Radahn simply never stops fucking attacking. There are very few moments of downtime during this fight, which is fine in a vacuum. Fights like Midra in this DLC and Abyss Watchers in DNS3 balance this aggression by having relatively small health bars for the point in the game that you're fighting them. Radahn, though, has an absolute dump truck of a health bar, so having to be locked in for so long can actively be draining on the player's end, even more so if they're using a build that simply isn't equipped to properly face these bosses. On my first and only winning attempt against Radahn while fighting solo, my fight was over 6 minutes long, which for a fight as intense and disorienting as Promise Consort Radahn is just way too fucking long in my opinion. For now, let's finally get into Phase 2 of Promise Consort Radahn and see what FromSoft's ultimate Elden Ring challenge is for us.
Tarnished One, aspiring Lord of the Old Order, if you have known sin, if you grieve for this world, then yield the path forward to us. To I, Miquella, and my promised consort, Radahn.
Radahn, Consort of Miquella, is in a lot of ways similar to the first phase of this fight. Both phases share many of the same attacks, though Phase 2 adds light beam follow-ups to most of them. This phase also comes with several unique attacks of its own that are just as problematic as those we've already discussed, if not more so. We're just going to go ahead and jump into those before I make my final argument for why I think this boss is purposely designed to be unfair. Light of Miquella. Radahn will usually start Phase 2 by using this attack, and the attack itself isn't terrible. It essentially summons a nuclear blast of holy damage for which the only way to dodge is to either run out of its radius before the attack hits, or to roll 5 or 6 times to achieve the same result. My main problems with this attack are, 1. Radahn is invulnerable to damage during the majority of this attack, since as soon as he starts levitating, he cannot be damaged via melee attacks. And 2, there is an extremely slim margin of error for this attack. If you are not running or rolling as soon as Radahn begins levitating, you are going to get hit. It can be very frustrating if you've barely made it to the edge of this attack's radius, only to get hit because you were a millisecond too late in beginning your sprint away from the epicenter. I'm not a huge fan of this attack, but compared to some of his others, it's fine. Quintuple Overhead Slash. This is one of Radahn's many clone attacks in Phase 2. For this one, he'll jump into the air before sending 4 clones down at you with a downward slash, before finally coming down himself. Most of the time, he'll follow this attack up with another combo immediately, so if you get hit by it, especially the final attack, you are more than likely going to be hit by some part of the follow-up combo. I really don't like this attack because, in my experience, it is impossible to consistently dodge this attack without taking some amount of damage. The key word there is consistently, because it's definitely possible to avoid taking damage from this attack, yet every time I did so, I could not possibly tell you what I did differently compared to the other times I did the same response, and I did take damage. It's incredibly inconsistent, and I despise that. We'll come back to this attack several times later in this section since this appears as part of several other combos. Thousand Year Voyage, aka the Grab Attack. This attack is the easiest in Radahn's kit to dodge, and honestly has the best grab hitbox I've ever seen in these games from FromSoft. It's a shame then that this attack barely has any punishment for the player getting hit by it, since the first time the attack lands, literally nothing happens except for Miquella whispering in your ear for a few seconds before letting you go. If you get hit by the second time, however, you will be instantly killed by having your heart stolen by Miquella. You can avoid this by using Miquella's Great Rune that you get from being the Erdtree avatar, and that's about all there is to this attack. Radahn can follow up several of his combos with this grab attack, and it's a perfect opportunity to get hits in or heal. I don't have any real problems with this attack on its own. Holy Meteor Crash. Similar to the Star Scourge Radahn fight, once you get Radahn to around 20% health, he will leap up into the air and, after a few seconds, come crashing down in a massive explosion. Since defeating Star Scourge Radahn is required to access this DLC, I think a lot of players will be able to understand what's happening and be able to run as far away as they possibly can within the confines of the arena to avoid taking damage. You can also iframe this attack if you want to punish it when he lands, but personally I don't think it's worth it. This attack is fine and I don't really have too much to say about it. Holy Explosion follow-ups. Several of Radahn's Phase 1 attacks that make a return in Phase 2 have holy damage follow-ups to them, the only exception being his Blood Flame Slash. Some of these combos end with Radahn creating a sea of light explosions that will sweep across the entire arena and the entire screen. When first encountering this, it can be incredibly disorienting, especially since so many lights are flashing on screen during this fight that I'm surprised they didn't put a seizure warning at the fog gate. Dodging through this attack is fine enough as long as you aren't recovering from taking another hit prior to the sea of light, but the visuals and the amount of damage it does are just too much in my opinion. One attack variation that I also want to make mention of is Radahn's Starcaller Cry in Phase 2, which, if you get hit by it, begins the longest combo that Radahn has in this entire fight, where he does his regular follow-up with the Meteor Shockwave, then jumps up in the air, slashes down several times before creating another Meteor Shockwave. In total, this attack takes 10 rolls to fully dodge from start to finish if you're using Light Load. The Phase 2 variant of Radahn's Meteor Summon attack will go down in history alongside Waterfowl Dance as one of the most difficult attacks to dodge in video game history. He starts the attack with the same sword plunge and meteor shots before using his quintuple downward slash followed immediately by his Sea of Light attack. In my several fights, Radahn used this within 30 seconds of getting into Phase 2, completely disorienting me and causing me to die over and over again, something that has been a common experience for many people online fighting this boss. And that is every single attack that Promise Consort Radahn can do in both Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this fight. If you noticed a trend during that rundown, it's that almost every single attack that Radahn has in this fight is either A, incredibly disorienting, or B, impossible to dodge consistently with only a few exceptions. This leads to the fight feeling extremely unfair when you go into it for the first time, and even once you get a handle on how the fight goes, they can still feel unfair because of how relentless Radahn is with his attack patterns. What makes this even worse is how, like I mentioned earlier, this fight essentially requires you to make certain build choices if you want to have a fair fight. Phase 2 of Promise Consort Radahn has so many beams of light flying around at all times that most of the damage you'll be taking during that part of the fight will be that holy damage, meaning that if you don't want to die in 2 hits, the Golden Braid Talisman found in the Shaman Village is essentially required for survivability. You may as well add the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to that list as well for reducing physical damage, since even without the holy damage, Radahn still hits like a goddamn freight train. And since fighting Radahn without a light equipment load is essentially handicapping yourself, heavy armor is essentially outlawed as well. God forbid you're using any sort of magic build either, because Radahn has 40% resistance to every single form of magic in the game according to Extra Life. With all of that being said, you may think that I absolutely hate everything about this boss, and yet I don't. Compared to bosses like Baal and Gaius, I have a lot more mixed feelings on Radahn that don't necessarily lean one way or the other overall. Compared to Elden Beast, fighting Promise Consort Radahn feels like you're actually fighting a god. This is not an even fight, and you are actively overcoming the odds when you beat him. The first time I managed to beat him solo, I felt the strongest sense of euphoria that I've ever felt from beating a boss in these games. Plus, in a vacuum, a lot of the aspects of this fight aren't that bad in and of themselves. It's just all of them combined that leads to the fight feeling unfun and unfair a lot of the time. This boss easily has the steepest learning curve out of any boss in FromSoft's entire catalog, and it's not even close. This design is so jarring compared to so many of the other bosses in this DLC that I'm honestly convinced that two different teams worked on this DLC. The first team was comprised of the people who made Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, who wanted to make bosses similar to those games in how they were tough but fair. The second team was comprised of the main Elden Ring developers who wanted to make bosses that were hard for the sake of being hard in order to keep up FromSoft's reputation. Team A was a team that made Midra, the Putrescent Knight, and other bosses I've talked about in the positive light, while Team B was the team that made Gaius, Bale, and Promised Consort Radahn. Given that they chose to end the DLC with a boss that was harder than Melania in similarly unfun and unfair ways, and given how many people online are praising Bale the Dread, who has similar design to those endgame Elden Ring bosses, I'm worried that once again FromSoft is going to learn the wrong lessons from the success of Shadow of the Erdtree, because with how this DLC ends, I genuinely wonder if they learned anything from the critical feedback on the base game whatsoever. I worry that FromSoft, with the triumph of Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree, is going to continue making bosses that are hard purely for the sake of being hard, and bosses like Melania and Promised Consort Radahn will become the new normal, while the more traditional tough but fair bosses like Midra and most of the lineups from previous games will slowly fade into obscurity. Overall, I really want to like this fight, but much like the light show present in Phase 2, I'm too blinded by the sheer number of faults present to be able to enjoy the fight consistently. And here I am in the future, about a week after writing and recording that segment, noticing something in the footage that further reinforces my argument. It has to do with the timing of attacks and opportunities to punish on Promised Consort Radahn. First, let's look at another boss that I already talked about, Dark Eater Midir from Dark Souls 3. Across my 5-minute winning attempt against him, I timed his attacks in order to calculate that the average timing between punish opportunities is around 10 seconds, with a few outliers and probably some timing errors on my part, but we're just going to round it to around 10 to keep things simple. In comparison, timing the same attack windows during the Promised Consort Radahn fight shows that, in Phase 1, the average timing between punish opportunities is around half of Midir's, at around 5 seconds. In Phase 2, this increases slightly to around 6.5 seconds, but that's mostly because he gains some longer attacks that increase that average, so let's still say it's around 5 seconds. The math for all of these should be on screen right now. In theory, this would rebuke my claim that Radahn doesn't give you clear and consistent attack opportunities, since he seems to give them so frequently. Meanwhile, Midir, in comparison, takes much longer. In actuality, though, it's not that simple. Almost all of Radahn's attacks involve multiple sword swings that weave into each other. So let's say that Radahn's average attack takes 5 seconds and consists of 2 hits. The first swing takes 2 seconds, the second swing takes another 2 seconds. That leaves you with 1 second to get a punish on Radahn before he launches into his next attack. This also lines up with how, despite each individual attack taking longer, my winning attempt against Midir in the footage that you're seeing took more than a minute less time than it took me to beat Radahn solo for the first time, and how it only took me 19 attack opportunities to kill Midir, while Radahn took me 58 when counting both phases. Combine that with how Radahn and Midir do similar amounts of damage per individual attack, that is to say, a lot, yet Radahn attacks significantly faster and with lots of disorienting flashing lights, and I think the problem becomes clear. When you can't properly see what's happening and then get killed in 2 or 3 hits, the learning process for this fight becomes, how the fuck was I supposed to dodge that, over and over again until you eventually learn the patterns, which can take forever because of Radahn's gargantuan health bar. This is a big part of why I enjoyed Radahn so much more on my later playthroughs when fighting him solo, compared to my first solo runs against him. I think that this literal math that I did serves to prove that Promised Consort Radahn is a poorly designed fight, especially compared to other bosses in this DLC and in previous FromSoft games. And while Dark Eater Midir isn't perfect either, the problems with Radahn are so glaring that it's impossible to overlook them in the same way that I personally can for Midir. This is why Promised Consort Radahn sucks. Upon finally defeating Radahn and Miquella, Shadow of the Erdtree just kind of ends, without any fanfare whatsoever. That's somewhat typical of FromSoft's DLCs, however, in all 3 Dark Souls games, there was some sort of small epilogue to do once you beat the final boss. Dark Souls 1 had Elizabeth to talk to after you saved Dusk of Ulasil, Dark Souls 2 had Vendrick giving his anti-curse blessing to all 3 crowns, and Dark Souls 3 had the Painter to give the Blood of the Dark Soul to. As far as I know, there isn't anything like this in Shadow of the Erdtree, which is really a shame in my opinion. There is an additional cutscene that tells us some shit that we already know, or would have guessed from earlier plot points in the DLC, and afterwards you get a headpiece that, while cool, gives you less overall stat buffs than the helmet that you get from beating the first boss of the DLC, which leaves this expansion feeling like it ends with a whimper rather than a bang. There's an easy solution to this though, FromSoft. Let us become God. And I'm not even kidding. Radahn is fought right in front of the gated divinity, and by the time you get to this point, you've probably already acquired all the great runes, so why not provide a new kind of ending here where you can become a god and create your own age, free from Marika, free from Ranni, free from Miquella. As it is now, the gate to divinity is blocked off due to a ledge that is slightly too high for you to climb up without abusing the geometry, and they've probably patched it out by now. It just feels anticlimactic, which is a real shame, because putting the ending aside, I really do like the story in this DLC. I don't know all the lore, but from what I've seen online so far, the amount of characterization given to both Marika and Miquella from this expansion is amazing, and Mesmer might be my favorite character story-wise in the entire game. Though despite his explicit connection to Melina in his Remembrance description, which was patched out and then patched back in for some reason, Melina has absolutely nothing to add to the DLC, with no unique dialogue at all. In fact, this entire DLC feels very sectioned off from everything else in the base game, which is similar to other FromSoft DLCs in some ways, but with a game as interconnected as Elden Ring, especially lore-wise, I really do wish that Melina had some more to do in the story, especially if you chose to inherit the Frenzied Flame to save her life, then use Miquella's needle to get rid of it. This action has no impact on Melina, who stays gone for the rest of the game, or Miquella, who made the needle in the first place, even 2 years after the game was initially released. There was so much potential for story connections to the base game, and I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't disappointed by it. There are also several other instances of connections between the base game and this DLC that I expected to be commented on in some way, but there was just nothing. Here's a list of ones that I can think of off the top of my head. Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame, has no unique dialogue if the player has inherited the Frenzied Flame, nor if they've gotten rid of it using Miquella's needle. Neither Miquella nor any of his NPC followers have any comment regarding whether or not the player has defeated Malenia and claimed her Great Rune. Likewise, Malenia has no dialogue if the player has killed her brother that she apparently loves so much that she tells you about him every time that she kills you. I'm honestly surprised that there wasn't any Clean Rot Knight NPC that tagged along with the entourage that this DLC has. The Dragon Priestess at the Grand Altar of Dragon Communion has no dialogue if you've killed Dragon Lord Placidusax. Likewise, Egon has no unique dialogue if you talk to him while wearing the Drake Warrior armor set from the base game. Mesmer has no unique dialogue if the player fights him while Melina is still alive, nor does Melina have any dialogue if you kill her brother. Witch Hunter Jaren has no dialogue referencing the events of the DLC, whether it be having anything to do with Redmane Freya, who does make reference to him once, or with Radahn having been brought back by Miquella. It's honestly a real shame because the story here in the DLC is incredible. I glossed over it earlier when talking about the enemy reuse in the hinterland area, but the wordless storytelling present in the Shaman village might just be the best story moment FromSoft has ever created. You don't even need to read the item descriptions of the 2 items here to understand the tragedy that went down in this place, and with the music adding to the atmosphere, it's incredible. I just wish that the same level of care and quality could have been present throughout other parts of the story. Moving on from that, here's some other miscellaneous thoughts that didn't really fit anywhere else in this video. The newly added ability to summon Torrent during the Elden Beast fight makes the final boss so much better compared to how it was before. Elden Beast is now significantly easier and more fun because the fight is no longer spent mostly running back and forth between Elden Beast, only to get 1 or 2 hits in and do that again for 20 minutes. Now, it's a high-intensity chase where you're jumping over attacks in an epic and intense final battle. With this addition, Radagon now essentially acts as the final boss, and Elden Beast is the victory lap, kind of like how Gehrman and the Moon Presence were in Bloodborne, and I think that the final boss works much better this way. My only problem with Torrent being added to this fight is that it pulls the camera back and kind of makes Elden Beast look a little small, which does diminish its majesty a bit, but I will happily take a slightly worse aesthetic for a much more entertaining fight. Thanks to the addition of the DLC weapons, Malenia has indirectly been made significantly easier. I fought her using the Melody Light Greatsword, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if you told me that she wasn't tested against it, since the Light Greatsword weapon class has the speed of a straight sword while only doing slightly less poise damage than a regular Greatsword, which combined essentially make Malenia fold like a wet paper towel. Using Melody, I was able to take her out in 4 attempts in less than 15 minutes, and I actually had fun doing it. I've also seen people fight her using the new Deflecting Hard tier, and that looks really fun too, even if she does heal from doing so, which I think is bullshit. The message hinting that you need to use a gesture to enter the hinterland is way too vague. It isn't the first time FromSoft has hidden something like this, but each time before it was more obvious than this. The new weapon types added in the DLC are some of the most fun I've had with this game, and it's honestly a shame that they're exclusive to this DLC. Players who don't purchase the DLC will be locked out of what will likely become the new PvP meta, and those who do purchase the DLC and want to start a new run will have to go all the way through Moog just to get these new weapon types. I would have liked to see some basic version of these weapons added to the Twin Maiden Husk shop alongside the weapons that are already there. The new side dungeons, catacombs, caves, and the new jail type of dungeons are all a significant step up in quality compared to their counterparts from the base game. There are also significantly fewer of these dungeons in the DLC, and 2 of them even lead to new regions, although the Dragon's Pit is quite short. I hope that, if FromSoft makes another game in the style of Elden Ring, that we get side dungeons of this quality rather than the quality of what we got in the base game. With all of that being said, that's pretty much everything I have to say about Shadow of the Erdtree. With how big this expansion is and how long it took to come out, I doubt that we'll see anything else Elden Ring related in the future, at least for this game. So as far as we know, this is the end of Elden Ring. I know that a large portion of this video was spent complaining about various elements, but I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the video. Shadow of the Erdtree is much more than the sum of its parts. While some individual aspects of it may be worrying or subpar, the experience as a whole, especially on our first playthrough, is immaculate. The highs are even higher than that of the base game of Elden Ring, and the lows, while still being low in comparison to FromSoft's other games, are nowhere near as low as some of the worst parts from the base game of Elden Ring. In all honesty, my immediate thoughts when I turned the game off after finishing the DLC was, this is what Elden Ring should have been from the beginning, which I choose to interpret as praise for this DLC more than it is shame for the base game. I would probably give Shadow of the Erdtree an 8 out of 10 if I were to put it on a number scale, but that doesn't really mean that much in the grand scheme of things, so I'll put it as simply as this. If you enjoyed Elden Ring, you will love this DLC. If you enjoyed FromSoft's other titles, you will love this DLC. If you enjoyed those other titles but didn't care much for the base game of Elden Ring, I would honestly still encourage you to give this DLC a shot, because in my opinion, it's the exact evolution from Dark Souls 3 that I was hoping for since 2016. With all that being said, my name is Thomas, I've been the Nightly Scrivener, and thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Hey there, this is Thomas. I just kind of wanted to take care of a few housekeeping things with this semi-unscripted outro. I just have a few bullet points here that I wanted to go through before the end of the video. So, first of all, I really want to thank a few people. First of all, big thank you to my friends Elijah and Simon, who played the game alongside me, not like multiplayer-wise, but we all happened to be playing through it solo at the same time, and so we got to compare experiences a lot of the time, and that really helped me formulate a lot of my opinions and arguments regarding this DLC. A similar thank you to my best friend Sam, who provided a lot of good discussion, especially about Promised Consort Radon. I know that our conversation probably seemed a lot more like the two of us just shitting on the boss for however long, but I promise it actually really did help me form, like, critical thoughts about that argument, so I really appreciate that. I also want to apologize for the poor audio that is omnipresent throughout this video. This is the first time that I've, like, properly made something of this scale for YouTube, like, for people to watch. And so all of this is recorded on my phone using my standard recorder app. Hopefully in the future, I'll be able to purchase some kind of proper microphone that will make my life so much easier and the audio quality so much better. But that's just kind of how it is at the moment, and I apologize if that got annoying after a while. I don't know when the next video is going to be out. As of right now, I haven't even started working on it. I'm thinking the next potential video or videos will probably be sort of like a mini-series on each Pokemon generation. Probably like a video on Gens 1 and 2, then 3, 4, 5, then 6 and 7, and then 8 and 9. But that's just sort of me thinking. There's also a possibility that Hollow Knight Silk Song actually exists and comes out within the next 6 months, in which case that'll probably be my next video or whatever comes after the Pokemon retrospective. But yeah, that's about all I have to say, or all that I can think of at the moment. So I really just want to extend one last thank you to everyone that actually watched through the video all the way up to this point. I really, truly, genuinely appreciate it. You can like, you can subscribe, it doesn't really matter, but I really do, yeah, I would really like it if you could share this with anybody who has played the DLC or is interested in playing the DLC. Just because I really enjoy discussion about this game, and I really hope that this video can provide a source for that kind of discussion. With all that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.